Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, where we help you manage workplace safety one episode at a time. And now, your very own Safety Pro, Blaine J. Hoffman.
All right, today's episode, it's all about record keeping. We've got several episodes on record keeping, and there's a reason why. It is one of the most frequently asked questions, not only that I get, but I probably have to imagine that most people get from small to medium-sized employers when you have somebody managing safety that's also managing, admin responsibilities for the office, doing sales, or, maybe HR, stuff like that. So we're just going to go right into each question. Some of these are repeats, but they bear covering again because they're important. They keep coming up. Okay, and we're going to start with a basic one about posting and what to post. The question is, what records must companies post at the workplace? So this basically, I'm going to go down a quick list here. Now, all employers have to display at every establishment that they have, wherever they normally post notices to employees, like a break room somewhere in the back where they clock in, something like that, bulletin board, where you would normally post sort of EEOC, wage and hour type posters, things like that. You've got to have a copy of the totals from the previous year's summary of occupational injuries and illnesses. Okay, so that's your 300-day summary form, or they allow an equivalent form. But to be honest with you, you just use the 300-day summary and you're going to be fine. But you have to have a total of the previous year's summary of injuries and illnesses. You have to have the Job Safety and Health Protection workplace poster. It's the OSHA 3165. There's also a 2203, or there's a state equivalent if you're in a state-run program. That informs employees of their rights and responsibilities under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So also, if there are any Spanish-speaking employees, there's a Form 3167 that also has to be posted as well in Spanish. Third, you have to post summaries of any petitions for variances from standards or record-keeping procedures. This is very rare, but if you're in a company, working for a company where you've petitioned OSHA to say, hey, our lockout tagout program, we have thousands of pieces of equipment, and we would like to petition for a variance to maybe allow us to only do an annual lockout tagout review of maybe 10% of them, because they're all so similar. Doing all of them would be a burden to the business. So, that kind of a petition, you would have to post the fact that you submitted a petition to OSHA and what you're asking. You have to post that there as well. And fourth, you have to post copies of all OSHA citations for any violations of standards. And those have to actually remain posted at or near that location of the alleged violation for 3 days or until the violations are corrected, whichever is longer. It's a good idea, best practice above and beyond, not only post any notice of citation, alleged violation of standards at the bulletin board, but you also have to post them at or as close as possible to where the alleged violation occurred. So somewhere at a machine or in a general work area, something like that. Another popular question I've gotten several times revolves around, again, record keeping, but this is a good one. Exercises that an employee does as a form of physical therapy, are those recordable? So it gets a little weird here. OSHA states that exercises that are basically self-administered physical therapy and would normally be recommended by a healthcare professional who trains the worker in the proper frequency, duration, or intensity of the exercise. That is considered physical therapy, and that's recordable on your 300 log. Remember, self-administered physical therapy, but they're a result of a recommendation by a healthcare professional who trains the worker in the proper frequency, duration, and intensity. So that is considered physical therapy. Okay, so even if the employee is doing them themselves before work or before clocking on or before beginning a shift or coming back from a break, something like that. If that was basically recommended by a healthcare professional and they were trained in the proper frequency, duration, and intensity of the exercise, how to actually properly perform the exercise, that's considered physical therapy, and that's prescribed and it's recordable. Physical therapy treatments are normally provided over an extended period of time, as therapy for an injury or illness and considered to be beyond first aid. So that's what we want to be looking at. If you have an employee that asks, the nurse or RN that says, hey, should I be stretching before I unload the truck and at the dock? And the nurse or doctor says, well, yeah, it's always a good idea to stretch, before you do any kind of physical activity. And, some simple stretches you could do include this, that, and the other. But it wasn't a result of an injury or illness. It's just more advice. It just makes good sense. That would fall into sort of that gray area where you want to first find out, did the employee experience an injury or illness? If not, if the employee is just asking for, good advice, that's all that is. Okay. Another question, are all record keeping requirements the same in all 50 states? Now, states that are operating OSHA approved state plans, they have to adopt the same, at a minimum, the same injury, illness, record keeping and reporting requirements as Part 1904 of the federal standard. They can go above and beyond and make some more stringent requirements, but at a minimum, they're going to be identical. So you can actually look at 1904.37 of the 29 CFR 1904.37 under state requirements for some information on that one. Another question about volunteers. Are volunteers considered employees for record keeping? So there's a 2005 letter of interpretation from OSHA talking about coverage of volunteers. And it says that if staff are volunteers who receive no monetary or other compensation, it's OSHA's view that they're not employees subject to coverage under the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Act. However, some states that operate their own safety and health state plan have laws that extend coverage to certain volunteers or other workers that would be exempt from federal authority. So you might want to make sure you check your state laws if you are in a state-run program. Now, it doesn't matter, regardless of whether your volunteers are covered or not. OSHA always encourages organizations to ensure that volunteers receive training that are outlined in the OSHA standards based on the work that they're going to be doing, like unloading trucks for an event, a charity event that the company's put together and got some volunteers. Opening packages and things like that with box cutters, things like that. Provide gloves training. That's just a best practice. That way the organization can reduce risks and provide a safer working environment for the volunteers. It also ensures that they're going to get back to work after the volunteer event as well. It's an odd question. I've seen this before. Are work-related cases involving chipped or broken teeth considered recordable? Yeah, actually they are under 1904.7B7. Cases are considered a significant injury or illness when diagnosed by a physician or other healthcare professional. So in the preamble to the final rule, work-related fractures of bones or teeth are recognized as constituting significant diagnosis, and if the condition is work-related, they have to be recorded at the time of initial diagnosis, even if the case does not involve any of the other general recording criteria. Meaning, even if it doesn't require, medical treatment beyond first aid, if a doctor, diagnoses, yep, you've got a chipped tooth, there you go back to work. That is considered a fracture or broken bone or tooth in the preamble to the record keeping rule. So yes, chipped teeth, recordable. What about if an employee does not follow work restrictions? Can the employer be cited? So the National Association of Manufacturers' legal challenge to OSHA's record keeping and reporting regulations is as follows, okay? Section 1904.7B4 deals with the recordability of cases in which a physician or other healthcare professional has recommended a work restriction. The section states that the employer, quote, should ensure that the employee complies with the recommended restrictions. That language is advisory and does not impose an enforceable duty upon employers to ensure that the employees comply with the recommended restriction. Now, this gets into an HR issue of whether or not the employee is following work rules, policies, or instructions. But as far as the employer being cited by OSHA for not forcing an employee to follow work restrictions, that language right there is purely advisory and does not impose an enforceable duty upon employers to ensure that the employees comply with the recommended restrictions. How about if an employee reports an injury or illness? Does that establish the existence of an injury or illness for record-keeping purposes? This gets a little dicey here. No, to be recordable, an incident must meet the record-keeping criteria. Just having the employee say, "I got injured," does not establish a recordable injury or illness. You have to actually determine if it meets any of the record-keeping criteria. So, in determining whether the case is recordable, you have to first decide whether the injury or illness, as defined by 1904, actually occurred. If the employer is uncertain about, whether an injury or illness occurred, then you can refer to the employee. You can send the employee to a physician or other healthcare professional to be evaluated, and you may consider the healthcare professional's opinion in determining whether or not that was work-related. What they're presenting with was the proximate cause was the workplace. Okay, you may consider that. Now, if a physician or other licensed healthcare professional diagnoses a significant injury or illness within the meaning of 1904.7, and the employer determines the case is work-related, that's when you would record it. Okay. Another interesting question: do I need to record an injury caused by medical treatment for another injury? So if an employee suffers an injury at the hands of medical personnel during the treatment for another condition, the new injury is recordable. Two examples, okay? In the first example, let's say an employee suffers a work-related hand injury and requires physical therapy. During the treatment, the therapist accidentally breaks the employee's finger. That new injury is work-related and recordable because the employee would not have been in physical therapy if it were not for the previous work-related injury. Does that make sense? You follow that? So OSHA considers this a direct line of causation, establishing a work-relatedness between, the workplace and the broken finger. The second example that might help you understand this a little bit better: let's say an employee dies during surgery or other complications that were made necessary by a work-related injury or illness 2 months after the original injury or illness. This case is recordable. If the underlying injury or illness was recorded prior to the employee's death, the employer must update the 300 log by lining out the information on less severe outcomes like days away from work or restricted work, and check the column indicating death. A common question involves whether or not something's recordable if it occurred before an employee clocked on or before they actually got inside the building. What about the parking lot? Is the parking lot considered part of the work environment? And what if they haven't clocked in yet? So the parking lot issue comes from the definition of the work environment in 1904.5b. So OSHA defines the work environment as, quote, the establishment and other locations where one or more employees are working or are present as a condition of their employment. The work environment includes not only physical locations, but also the equipment or materials used by the employee during the course of his or her work. So employees are present in the parking lot as a condition of employment, which means the parking lot is part of their work environment. So another statement here in 1904.5a, quote, you must consider an injury or illness to be work-related if an event or exposure in the work environment either caused or contributed to the resulting condition or significantly aggravated a pre-existing injury or illness. So this also means that the recordability is not affected by whether or not the employee has clocked in for the day, or maybe they've clocked out. That has nothing to do with it. The employee is present as a condition of employment. So that's going to get you right into the recordability status. So here's an example. Let's say an employee drives to work, parks in the employee parking lot, gets out of the car, slips on some ice, with the result being a broken arm. That's recordable. The injury was caused by an exposure in the work environment, which is, of course, we've already established, the parking lot. Okay. So if that's considered the work environment, then that's exactly what you're going to be looking at. Where did it occur? Not so much whether they were clocked in or clocked off. Okay. And it does not specifically meet the exemption that's also in 1904.5 B2, which includes, among other things, employees who are present as members of the general public. There's also an exemption for whether or not employees are making on a personal errand. Okay, and I'm talking about that here in a second. So the work environment has to have some connection to the workplace. If your establishment does not have a designated parking area, employees may have to park on a public street. So the public street is not considered part of the work environment, partly because the employer, you have no control over the conditions of the street, like snow removal or crumbling curbs, things like that. On the other hand, if the company forms some sort of an agreement to use and maintain a designated area of a larger parking lot that is shared by several employers, you could argue that that's a connection to the workplace. Thus, that parking area could be considered part of the work environment. So the other exemption I want to make sure that we understand is if the employee leaves as part of a personal errand, as doing something not work related. Okay. And the issue, it gets a little tricky with this one, is whether or not they're on a designated break or like lunch. If the employee comes to the supervisor and says, "Hey, I've got to take off. I've got to go run and drop this paperwork off at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles before my tags expire," and it's like, well, okay, you just take about a half hour personal time, and that employee leaves. That's a personal errand. Where you have to be careful is whether or not the injury or illness occurred on, as a result of them being there to begin with. Okay. You have to make sure that you understand that. And Chapter 5 of OSHA's Record Keeping Policies and Procedures Manual answers a few of those questions about parking lots and can provide some other guidance. And I have a feeling this is gonna come up again in future episodes. So we'll probably maybe dedicate a whole episode for this topic. What about an employee that has an injury or illness and is not recordable, but later becomes recordable? When do you record it? Okay. So basically, if you can identify a single event or exposure that caused the injury, like a trip or a fall, then record the case using that date, even if the injury was not recordable until a later date. Okay, does that make sense? So here's an example. Let's say an employee falls and cuts their hand, but they don't require medical treatment, or otherwise it doesn't meet any of the other recording criteria. But a couple weeks later, that cut gets infected and requires a prescription antibiotic. So that case would become recordable using the date of the fall, because the precipitating event was identified. That's what caused, that was the original date. So if you can't identify a single event or exposure, the injury is recorded from the date it becomes recordable, or the date it is diagnosed by a physician or another licensed healthcare professional. So here's another example. Let's say an employee complains of wrist pain, and their workstation is given some sort of ergonomic evaluation to alleviate the condition. 3 weeks later, the employee visits a physician and is diagnosed with carpal tunnel syndrome. They're given physical therapy, placed on a restricted duty, that whole bit. The injury would be recorded on the date of the diagnosis by the physician, since the injury didn't meet the recording criteria before that time, and you can't really identify a single date or incident that caused the condition. If the initial complaint had involved, discomfort that required a restriction in work duties, the injury would have been recorded on the date of the complaint because it met that general record keeping or recording criteria. Okay, restricted duty. But because that wasn't the case, you have to go by the date that it was diagnosed by a physician. So this whole concept of recording on the date of diagnosis, that comes from Part 1904.7B7, which requires recording significant cases such as cancer, things like that, on the date of diagnosis because no specific date of onset can be determined. This concept has been extended to other cases where a specific event or incident cannot be identified. So if you can identify an event or incident that caused the injury, record the case using that date. If it cannot be determined, an employee says, I don't know, it just started bothering me a couple weeks back, I don't really remember, it's the date that it was diagnosed or the date that it does meet any of the record-keeping criteria, okay? What if I assign an employee or an employee asks for light duty before an injury happens? Is that recordable? Let's see here. OSHA, well, there's a couple of things. OSHA's position is that preventative measures taken to protect employees are not recordable. So if you have an employee who complains of discomfort and asks for lighter duty or a temporary transfer, and is still capable of performing their normal job duties, that would not be considered a recordable incident. However, you knew there was one of those coming, right? However, if the transfer or restricted duty is necessary because the employee experienced too much pain or discomfort to actually continue normal job duties, that incident must be recorded. This may include recording the restricted duty days, if applicable. Listen to this. Even if the restricted duty was not recommended by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, if you self-impose, if the employer restricts the worker's duty because they could no longer perform their normal duties, that is recordable. What about an employee who regularly works a 10-hour shift or 12-hour shift, but is restricted to working just a regular 8-hour shift following a work-related injury? Would that be considered recordable? So in general, the company, the employer, has to record any case in which an employee's work is restricted because of an injury. Okay. A work restriction, now that's a work-related injury, by the way. A work restriction occurs when the employer keeps the employee from performing one or more routine functions of the job, or from working the full workday that they wouldn't otherwise have been scheduled to work. So this case would be recordable if they normally would have worked 10 hours or 12 hours had they not have been injured. So that's considered a restriction. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. I have a ton more, as you can imagine, that I've accumulated over the years. I still, week to week, I'll get emails about folks asking questions regarding recordability. But I'll have more episodes on this. But keep the questions coming. They get us talking a little bit about what's recordable, what's not. It's always interesting to see new and unique situations that pop up in the workplace and helping folks, work through those issues. So again, thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes and visit the website and make sure you subscribe to the podcast and go ahead and leave a rating and review so that I can continue to improve, what we're doing here on the podcast. Thanks for listening and be safe.
Thanks for listening to the Safety Pro Podcast. Be sure to visit www.consulthoffman.com for articles and information about safety services. To have Blaine read your question on the show, email him at customerservice@consulthoffman.com. Be sure to have 2 F's and 2 N's on Hoffman. Until next time, be safe.